Yeah, so thank you first of all to all you for joining our webinar today on racism, violence, and capitalism. This is a conversation that's been underway for some time within ESCRnet. One of the things that we repeatedly heard from our members is that attacks on human rights defenders are not isolated events. They do not occur in a vacuum, but rather intimately linked with the work of human rights defenders and the interests that they oppose. And these interests are often tied to the wider economic model, which prioritizes profit and relies on exploitation and ongoing dispossession, which is sometimes referred to by members as development aggressions. The repression faced by human rights defenders and their communities today is in turn part of a longer history of violence used to silence opposition to colonialism, imperialism, and the wider capitalist model. This analysis is also present in ESCRNet's Common Charter for Collective Struggle, which was developed by social movement members and ratified by the wider membership. The Common Charter names 5 common conditions that lead to the impoverishment and dispossession of communities globally, of which growing repression is one. So this has sparked a conversation within ESCRNet relating to the structural nature of violence in our current system. One of the examples that has dominated the global news cycle is the current events in the United States relating to the killings of Black people by the police. Historically, racist violence has been embedded in the structure of the US society, from slavery through legal segregation to the mass incarceration of Black people. And the recent brutalization of Black communities and protesters in solidarity with Black lives is a clear example that this is not a remnant of the past. As recently as last week, in the case of Breonna Taylor, an emergency medical worker, we were reminded how police can kill Black people even in their sleep with impunity. Racism has historically played an important role as a tool of control. In the US, it's been used to divide, dispossess Black, Indigenous, and white communities to maintain the power of a small elite. Likewise, it supports a narrative that depicts communities of color and poor communities as criminal, lazy, morally degenerate, and ultimately responsible for their own marginalization and poverty. These narratives justify the existing inequalities as well as use of violence against certain groups. The use of state violence is intimately linked to wider patterns of systemic exclusion and dispossession. In many impoverished communities and communities of color around the world, the state is only present through violence. This has been starkly highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Across the globe, impoverished communities are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 due to pre-existing disparities in wealth, access to healthcare, and generalized absence of the state in terms of meeting human rights obligations. In the US, Black people have been several times more likely to die of COVID-19, and the indigenous Navajo Nation has been ravaged by the virus with a higher per capita death rate than any US state. In turn, these are the very communities disproportionately impacted by state violence. At the same time, state violence is a vehicle to protect elite interests. ESCRnet members have highlighted a pervasive global trend of corporate capture of the state and its institutions by a small corporate elite that exercises undue influence over our democratic and judicial institutions to the detriment of human rights and the environment. When states serve a small corporate elite, the violent capacities of the state are also at the disposal of those elite interests. This points to the existence of a political economy of violence, where those that benefit from capitalism and those that suffer its consequences are the same people that benefit from and suffer the consequences of racism and state violence. The political economy of violence is evident whenever dispossessed and impoverished communities dare to protest their conditions and are met with defamation, threats, and murder. Likewise, the current extractive model, with an insatiable appetite for natural resources and wealth accumulation, is a key driver for conflict and violent dispossession. Understanding the political economy of violence means understanding how our dominant economic and political systems originated in the violence of dispossession and genocide, how they rely on police and military violence to sustain massive inequalities and ongoing imperialism, and ultimately generate violence at all levels. Injustices suffered by impoverished communities and communities of color around the world will not be rectified through mere superficial changes in policies, but require radical restructuring of systems that have been built over centuries. Systemic racism and state violence are intimately linked with and mutually reinforced by capitalism. Thus, when examining and critiquing systemic racist violence, it's essential to examine and critique the structural causes for poverty and dispossession. It's essential to examine the dominant economic system and who it serves. But these are not issues that are unique to the US context. Now we're going to switch to our three speakers from three different regions. They'll speak to these issues from their experiences. I want to invite Christina Tinay Palabay from the Philippines to speak. She is the Secretary General of Karapatan Alliance for the Advancement of People's Rights, linking grassroots struggles across the country. And she's also Regional Council member of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development.
Thank you everyone for this timely webinar. Good evening to us here in the Asia Pacific region. Good morning and good afternoon elsewhere. Um, Violence in Philippine society historically and in the present day realities is rooted in and engendered and driven by systems that promote neo-colonial relations, neoliberal economic agendas, state-sponsored and inspired violence, and patriarchal cultural norms in society. We see increased tensions when neocolonial relations manifest during territorial disputes, as in the claims over the West Philippine Sea, when China continues to encroach on Philippine sovereign waters and territory. And I think they're also doing that to um, Malaysia and Vietnam, despite international tribunal rulings. And it also manifests when the US maintains its military presence within Philippine territory and asserts US jurisdiction, trumping Philippine laws on issues related to crimes committed by US military personnel in the country, or when it continues to provide funding to Philippine military and police for state-sponsored bloody campaigns, such as in the drug war and counterinsurgency program counterinsurgency program. We look at our domestic economy and how it is kept afloat by overseas Filipino workers' remittances, with 10 million Filipinos living and working outside the country out of 110 million of us, and are subjected as well to racism and discrimination in their host countries. Our domestic economy is also kept afloat uh, by hot money through finance capital and foreign direct investments such as in mining, logging, and agricultural corporations or plantations. Or in short, as mere small cog in the global supply chain of raw materials and markets. And while we rank among nations in terms of mineral deposits such as nickel, gold, copper, the majority of our people have remained poor, in fact, dirt poor, especially during this time of the pandemic. We have the highest unemployment levels in history at present, and poverty levels are at record high too, with the agricultural sector composed of peasants and indigenous peoples are more left behind as before. There is the prioritization of social services such as health, education, and housing. Right now, in the country, there's a discussion on the national budget for next year. And yes, even if it's during the time of the pandemic, there is very minimal increase in uh, public funds for health services. While corruption scandals plague the health sector and many agencies, and there is increased funding, public funding for foreign debt payments, infrastructure, and military and police funding. Climate challenges are overwhelming, considering the staggering impacts of the denudation of forests due to mining and logging, the reclamation of our seas for expansion of businesses, and weak environmental protection policies and programs. Which is why we think that there is an infrastructure of impunity, as we call it, Public service and good governance have become obsolete in the language of government, and what remains are plain expressions of greed, megalomania, and tyranny. The poor are slaughtered in the name of the drug war and public order and safety. The activists, opposition members, and journalists are killed, vilified, threatened, jailed, and are called terrorists to undermine their calls and actions for truth, accountability, and social change. Patriarchal constructs are strengthened when sexist and misogynist pronouncements by those in power, including the president, are normalized and promoted, and thus gender based violence is to a certain extent institutionalized. And as objective conditions, such as wage gaps, sexual discrimination in workplaces, and inaccessibility of land for women peasants remain. Alternative learning institutions put up by indigenous communities and NGOs are being torn down by state forces and paramilitaries under the guise of anti-terrorism campaigns, while indigenous children and their teachers are terrorized by continuing military operations. Violence is thus normalized and promoted because the set of laws and policies, even if at times are seen as progressive, and the Philippines known in the region as among the most number among the countries or governments which has signed the most number of human rights international human rights treaties and instruments, but these are far from the realities, and the violence is built in, so to speak, in the current system that has promoted the status quo and unequal relations. Thus, every day, the lines are being drawn more clearly. On one hand, you have the instrumentalities of government, including state forces, executive offices, houses of Congress, and even the judiciary. You have big business, foreign and local. You have interest nations such as the US, China, Russia, Canada, Australia, etc. You have the big landlords who continue to perpetuate the colonial vestiges of the Spanish and American colonialism in the country. And on the other hand, you have the majority of the population, the farmers, the fisher folks, indigenous peoples, workers in the private and public sector, doctors and health workers, women, young people, the urban poor, journalists and activists and members of the opposition. They are at the losing end. We are at the losing end. And we are at our breaking points, especially during the pandemic. And thus, this context and lines guide the strategies by movements both within and outside the Philippines to push back, to resist, and to lay the foundations to effect comprehensive and systemic change. We are here for the long haul, as we say, as we cannot change a centuries old set of policies or systems and practice in one go. We organize among the poor communities, communities affected, and among allies. We build organized strength at the local levels to impact national policies and concerns. As we deep dive into learning and unlearning the realities in the communities and build collective power from the ground up, we organize among the youth, the LGBTQ plus persons with disabilities, even the, believe it or not, the fandoms. Most of them are from South Korea, or the fandoms, the fan clubs, and even dance crews and street sweepers. As Filipino migrants are in more countries than UN member states, we organize among them and inform them of the roots of the diaspora. We also promote alternative learning through indigenous schools in the community-based and national learning institutions as we push for human rights and relevant education, even in digital spaces. We build alliances and networks, and as they say, because we cannot live in silos, and we must do all we can to work with those who may have different ideologies, religious beliefs, and economic status to promote human rights principles and issues. We practice collective care, even as we are mindful of the need to ensure individual care and protection, and we inform ourselves on the need to be secure and safe as defenders and members of the community. We promote gender equality and bit by bit challenge the norms that put us in boxes and impede collective action within our own movements, and more so before the community in the communities and in the general public. We provide food, medical, and other forms of aid for those who need it most through humanitarian responses and relief missions. We continue to speak out the truth, including the hard facts, the compelling evidence, stripped of fake news, disinformation, and distorted realities and concepts. We also support allies in government and parliaments and inform them consistently on the realities. We document and monitor rights violations as we document and monitor our learnings and realizations as movements, and as we amplify the need to know and own our collective battles and strengths. Lastly, we ensure solidarity, and we seek it and we find it, whether in the halls of the UN, the ICC, even the US Congress, or in the streets of Chicago, or Portland, or Mumbai, Cairo, Rio de Janeiro, or Hong Kong. So our struggles are, in the end, our commonalities of experiences and struggles are rooted in a global system that promotes, as I said, built in the kind of system that we have. But at the same time, I think that our responses to such inequities, to such a system, are also built in our movements and in our communities. As long as we continue to pursue learning, as long as we continue to be in solidarity and build bridges with one another across borders, and despite the numerous challenges and differences set against us. Good evening.
Thank you so much, Chinai, for your powerful presentation. I'm going to call on Sabu Sikode from South Africa. He is the founding president of Abahlali Basim Jondolo, which is a grassroots democratic social movement of more than 55,000 shack dwellers in South Africa that campaigns against evictions and for public housing.
Thank you, Ruben, and thank you so much to the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Network for organizing this important discussion. I also wish to extend my greetings to my fellow panelists, Francisco from Guatemala and Tinai. And just to say to Tinai, the Abahlali Basamjondolo, the Shack Dwellers Movement of South Africa, continue to stand in solidarity with the people of Philippines. And we are saying our hearts, our souls are with you in your struggle. For us in this part of the sea, racism, violence, and capitalism are a great monster that we need to confront. Our movement was founded on the foundation of respect and dignity for all humanity. There are no borders to the human world, and every human being must be counted as a human wherever they are. We're very clear from the onset that a human being is a human being wherever and whenever they can find themselves. We are also very clear that there should be no human borders and that the borders that do exist were created by colonialism in order to divide and rule us. Color, race, language, creed, nationality, or religion do not define us. We are something deeper than these features. However, colonialism, which was a system of violence, and racism on which capitalism was built, divided a single humanity. Like colonialism, capitalism was always violent and always racist. In South Africa, colonialism forced Africans off their lands. They were then forced to work in a system of racial capitalism in which they had no rights. There was a similar vandalization of humanity across the colonial world. To this day, the countries that were colonized remain poor, and the United States continue to lead the imperialist forces that prevent the oppressed from determining their own future. This has been happening for a very long time, for a very long time. We have recently seen a US-backed coup in Bolivia. In 2004, we saw the same in Haiti. For these reasons, the problems of violence, racism, and capitalism cannot be separated. They are all part of the same monster, a monster that vandalizes our humanity so that the rich can get richer while the poor get poorer. The outrage at the recent killing of George Floyd in the US has focused global attention on racism and the racist violence of many states. In South Africa, police killed 3 times more people than the police in the US. This shows that having a Black government does not on its own solve the problem of racist state violence. Colonialism made Black people in South Africa not to be counted as human. To this day, it is common to hear people on our protests say, we are humans and not animals. What happens after apartheid is that a Black elite join the white oppressors in their gated communities, private schools, fancy. The outrage at the recent killing of George Floyd in the US has focused global attention on racism and the racist violence of many states. In South Africa, police killed 3 times more people than the police in the US. This shows that having a Black government does not on its own solve the problem of racist state violence. Colonialism made Black people in South Africa not to be counted as human. To this day, it is common to hear people on our protests say, we are humans and not animals. What happens after apartheid is that a Black elite join the white oppressors in their gated communities, private schools, fancy offices, and houses. The majority who remain locked out continue to be treated as less than human. Our leaders become amabhunu amnyama, Black Boers in South Africa. We will only finally defeat the monster of racism when land, wealth, and power are shared fairly amongst all the people. We cannot defeat this monster in one country because, as we have seen in Bolivia and Haiti, imperialism will not allow this to happen. Therefore, the struggle for what we have called a living communism must be a global one. The murder of Randall Echanil and Zara Alvarez in the Philippines has forced a global debate on state repression, which is also an expression of racism. These attacks are part of a wider pattern on attack on activists, which is similar to what we experience here in South Africa. We have lost 18 comrades to state murder and other kinds of political violence since 2009. But it is only poor Black people who are murdered like this. We remain, as we were during apartheid and colonialism, people who do not count to state and most of elite society. Racism is a cancer that we should all mobilize to confront as it breeds violence and hate in our society. In South Africa, Black labor tenants on farms are killed with impunity. Nobody bothers to investigate and prosecute those who commit these murders. But when white farmers are killed in the same way, the state uses all its available resources to hunt, arrest, and prosecute those who are implicated. When white farmers are murdered, premiers and cabinet ministers vacate their fancy offices and to vote to offer their support to white farmers, but they never do the same when poor Black folks are murdered with impunity. Capitalism has captured our state to work against the people that elect government into power. That's how dangerous capitalism can be. Capitalism promotes individualism over collectivism. It promotes greed and competition. Its roots are in colonialism, slavery, and apartheid. Capitalism still needs racism for it to exist. Without racism, it could not exploit workers in the global south and destroy the environment in these countries. Capitalism uses racism to hide its blood and debt. It does the same with sexism. Every rich family in South Africa, where both parents are working in well-paying jobs, also has a poor Black woman doing all the work in their homes and looking after their children. There can be no real fight against racism that is not also a fight against capitalism. There can be no real fight against capitalism that is also not a fight against racism. It is also true that every real fight against sexism must also be a fight against capitalism, and that a real fight against capitalism must also be a fight against sexism. At times, the violence perpetrated by the state against the people is engineered by capitalism. When we are constantly forced off our lands, we know our states are working to please the capitalist. This capitalist system practice works against democratic practice and pure spirit of Ubuntu. Just as our oppressors learn from each other and work together, so to the oppressed must learn from each other and in solidarity with each other. Organizations are built out of local struggles, but connection needs to be made so that the struggle can be global. Here in South Africa, we say an injury to one is an injury to all. With the climate crisis threatening the whole world, the revolution against capitalism will have to be global. But I must warn as I conclude that in order for us to root out capitalism, we cannot simply start at the top level. The top-down approach is not going to work for us. Hence, a social movement around the world are organizing from below. We are building the power of the impoverished and the marginalized from below. We continue to educate ourselves and our communities so that we can confront these monsters. We need to build solidarity between and within different communities across the globe. And we need to build international alliance as a way to confront the monster of racism, violence, as well as capitalism. So the task is not going to be easy. I want to make a call that we all unite as a powerful force, obviously, across, color lines across many nations to really confront what confined us in the dark corners of our society that we find ourselves. So in that way, we say amandla remains ours, power remains to the people. I want to thank you one and all.
Thank you very much, Sabu, and thank you for sharing that powerful call to to action and solidarity. I think that's a really important component of this. And we'll move to our last speaker, but certainly not least, Francisco Mateo Rocael Morales from Guatemala is the General Coordinator of Consejo de Pueblos Ustash and of Consejo de Dirección del Consejo del Pueblo Maya. He was the chair of the International Board of ESGRnet, and he is a member of the Provisional Coordination of Movimiento de los Afectados por Represas in Latinoamérica. So over to you, Francisco.
Muy buenos días a cada uno de ustedes. Pues siempre es un honor, un placer compartir con ustedes nuestras miradas en relación al trabajo que se realiza, en relación también al contexto. Pues la verdad, esta es una gran oportunidad para expresar y para buscar también solidaridad. Así es de que saludamos a cada uno de ustedes que están escuchando, están presenciando esta iniciativa muy importante desde la red DESC. Bueno, yo creo que en el caso guatemalteco y en el caso regional, pues vivimos la profundización de la violencia como un instrumento de dominación. La verdad es que esto se ha pues complicado con los últimos gobiernos que se han dedicado a desmantelar la institucionalidad que dejaron los acuerdos de paz. Es decir, la poca apertura que provocaron los acuerdos de paz firmados entre el Estado y ¿cómo se llama? Y las Fuerzas Armadas rebeldes en esa época, pues ahora prácticamente con el actual gobierno ha sido desmantelado. Eso, hay un retroceso en el ejercicio de los derechos humanos. También, al igual que en otros países, ha habido una campaña en contra de los derechos humanos en Guatemala. Obviamente eso solo favorece a los poderes tradicionales que históricamente pues han utilizado el racismo, han utilizado la violencia como un instrumento de dominación. Todo este problema se ha profundizado aún más con la pandemia, ¿no? En este año difícil que hemos vivido, pues ha sido evidente que en el país se han profundizado otros problemas. Por ejemplo, podríamos decir que la militarización de los territorios se ha normalizado. Solo en el inicio del año, el gobierno ha autorizado 5 estados de sitio, por ejemplo, ¿no? Donde han militarizado y han provocado violencia física y psicológica en contra, digamos, de comunidades, especialmente de las áreas de Alta Verapaz e Izabal, que es la región donde las empresas tienen intereses para pues construir proyectos de energía como hidroeléctricas, pero también donde hay intereses por la minería y monocultivos, especialmente lo que tiene que ver con la palma aceitera, ¿no? Entonces, la violencia, incluso también es importante decir que ha habido, digamos, en los últimos años una tesis construida por el poder corporativo y también el Estado de señalar a las luchas comunitarias como, es decir, vincularlas con el crimen organizado. Esa es una situación lamentable porque esa es una narrativa que prevalece y ahora se está utilizando para justificar la militarización de los territorios, es decir, el uso de la fuerza en contra de algunas comunidades donde realmente hay intereses corporativos en relación a los bienes naturales comunes de, digamos, en los territorios. Esa es una situación que se ha profundizado con la pandemia y también está la lucha contra el narcotráfico. Eso también ha justificado la militarización de la sociedad. El presupuesto para el 2021 ahorita ha habido un incremento, casi 3.000 millones de quetzales se va a asignar al ejército. El ejército está también ahora asumiendo otras funciones como la construcción de caminos, de obras sociales, que eso no tiene nada que ver, digamos, con las funciones constitucionales del ejército. Sin embargo, hay como una tendencia de remilitarización de la sociedad, y esa es una situación preocupante porque pues en la historia reciente el ejército de Guatemala aún pues tiene muchas denuncias pendientes en relación a violencia contra los derechos humanos y crímenes de lesa humanidad, que ahorita está precisamente en proceso, ¿no? También es importante mencionar que en los últimos meses se ha agudizado el ataque en contra de periodistas desde dos líneas. Por ejemplo, podríamos resumirlo. Primero, contra comunicadores y comunicadoras que han hecho un esfuerzo de informar de manera independiente, vinculados con radios comunitarias, con periodismo comunitario. Como consecuencia de esta cultura o esta campaña de violencia en contra de defensores de derechos humanos, pues estos comunicadores han sido atacados en el ejercicio de sus funciones, ¿no? Por denunciar, por hacer investigaciones periodísticas, han sido criminalizados, han sido judicializados por parte de empresas extractivistas, pero también por parte de funcionarios públicos. También así ha pasado con periodistas que se han dedicado a denunciar la corrupción en el propio gobierno, ¿no? Que han sufrido campañas de desinformación en su contra y también judicialización. Y esta es una situación que aún viene a complicar la situación que nosotros estamos viviendo. Otro elemento que ahora se ha marcado aún más en el país y en la región es también la criminalización en contra de la economía informal, que muy mal lo denomina, digamos, el sector privado, con la argumentación, digamos, de soluciones ante la crisis económica. Pues se está revisando todo esto, digamos, ajustes a los tributos, a los impuestos, también, digamos, obligando a la gente más pobre a pagar impuestos. No se está hablando de la necesidad de que las grandes corporaciones o los grandes ricos paguen más impuestos, sino que hay como una tendencia de obligar aún más a la gente empobrecida a pagar impuestos para sostener y para salir de la crisis, ¿no? Entonces, ha habido persecución en contra de la gente que vende en las calles, ha habido persecución en contra, digamos, de asociaciones y grupos que, sobre todo en contra de los pueblos indígenas, que tienen esa tradición de crear sus propios mercados, mercados comunales, mercados libres entre los pueblos y entre las comunidades. Y esa es una situación que hemos empezado a ver, que por parte del Estado se está empezando a denunciar y a descalificar, digamos, estas formas tradicionales de hacer mercado comunitario, eh, por la argumentación también de la aglomeración, ¿no? Por la distancia, el distanciamiento social que esta pandemia ha provocado. Eso también ha sido una narrativa muy común para desvalorar este esfuerzo. Es importante entonces afirmar que debido a las medidas autoritarias que el actual gobierno ha implementado en medio de esta pandemia del coronavirus, pues la cultura de violencia, la opresión, incluso la violencia intrafamiliar han incrementado debido a las grandes limitaciones, por ejemplo, de movilidad. Por ejemplo, los toques de queda han obligado a la gente a quedarse más en casa, y también ha permitido que actores tradicionales que en la época del conflicto armado interno estuvieron vinculados con violaciones a derechos humanos, me estoy refiriendo a paramilitares, ahora se han pues reorganizado en medio de estas medidas autoritarias para también reprimir a la población. Es lamentable que en Guatemala actualmente existen aproximadamente 30,000 personas detenidas solo por violar el toque de queda, es decir, por no llegar a tiempo a su casa o por estar en la calle por alguna razón, por algún descuido o simplemente porque no encontraron transporte para poder llegar a su casa, ¿no? Entonces, finalmente podemos afirmar que la crisis ha provocado serios daños a la economía nacional, pues ahora las medidas económicas que el gobierno está asumiendo, pues son medidas dictadas por el poder económico dominante en el país, pues son deuda, más endeudamiento, digamos, para nuestro país, favores para las empresas, es decir, como ha sido siempre la crisis cíclica del capitalismo, siempre afecta directamente al Estado, porque como se ha dicho comúnmente, en este sistema, pues las ganancias de las empresas se privatizan. Mientras tanto, cuando hay deudas, cuando hay pérdidas, se socializan, ¿no? Esto son como las grandes contradicciones de este sistema perverso, ¿no? Por lo tanto, no queda más que reflexionar como en esta mañana se está realizando. No queda más que organizarnos más, construir alianzas como muy bien se ha dicho en esta plataforma. Creemos nosotros como pueblos indígenas y como organizaciones que nosotros sí deberíamos de contemplar las dos vías. Esa vía, digamos, de articulación y lucha desde las comunidades, desde los pueblos, ejerciendo la libre determinación y la autonomía de los pueblos es importante e imprescindible ante esta crisis general que estamos viviendo. Pero también ojalá que a nivel global se vaya organizando también una fuerza y una alternativa para poder enfrentar esto. Necesitamos transitar a un nuevo modelo de vida, que la economía sea solidaria, que sea plural, que la economía no debe ser más dominada por el mercado, sino más bien debe estar bajo el control de los pueblos, de la institucionalidad de los pueblos. Eh, entonces, creemos nosotros que urge construir pactos, nuevos pactos. En el caso del Consejo del Pueblo Maya, estamos ahorita promoviendo por lo menos 4 pactos básicos para poder sentar las bases para la construcción de un nuevo Estado, de un nuevo planteamiento. Estamos hablando de un primer pacto, ponernos de acuerdo sobre el régimen político. No podemos continuar con una política capturada por el crimen organizado y las corporaciones. Eso no nos lleva a ningún lado. También necesitamos un pacto económico donde la economía sea plural y solidaria y que hayan muchos sujetos y sujetas de la economía, que la economía no sea controlada por las élites, por unas pocas familias, sino que la economía esté dirigida no para la acumulación de más riqueza en pocas manos, sino que una economía solidaria orientada para el buen vivir de los pueblos. También nosotros estamos planteando la construcción de una cultura plurinacional. Para terminar con el racismo, es importante también la descolonización del pensamiento como un proceso permanente, y también importante es la posibilidad de crear, digamos, un nuevo sistema educativo, igual que propicie el buen vivir para los pueblos. Nuevos relacionamientos sociales necesitamos, ¿no? Debemos superar esto del racismo y la violencia como instrumentos de dominación que solo favorece a las élites tradicionales de nuestros países, ¿no? Las grandes corporaciones. Finalmente, nosotros estamos planteando la justicia plurinacional, como también construir una justicia que integre todas las formas de vida de los pueblos. Los pueblos indígenas, nosotros tenemos nuestro propio sistema de justicia, un marco jurídico que pues tradicionalmente se ha utilizado, sin embargo ha sido desconocido y también criminalizado en este país. Entonces creemos nosotros que necesitamos un mundo diferente, que globalicemos la solidaridad y la pluralidad y no globalicemos la dominación, no globalicemos el egoísmo y el individualismo. Muchísimas gracias.
Many thank you to you as well, Francisco, and thank you for sharing your vision. And just before we go, I just wanted to leave you with a final question or a bit of food for thought. So, how should this understanding of the interconnectedness between structural racism, state violence, and capitalism, how should that shape our strategies going forward? Our panelists have already come up with some of their thoughts, but I think it would be good for us to keep thinking about how this will affect our work going forward.